I want to talk a little bit about one of our favorite subjects, and that is climate change and global warming. I'll start off with a map here. New Jersey, Maryland, Philadelphia, and in between Philadelphia and the Delmarva Peninsula, my state, the state of Delaware. And there's a map here, Mr. President, that's hard probably to see from up there or on television, but the outline of this map, that is Delaware today, all right? A couple hundred years from now, if we don't do something to reduce, continue to make progress on reducing carbon dioxide, Delaware will not look like the outline of that map. It's not going to look just like the green, but it'll be somewhere between the outline of that map and the green that we see here that depicts Delaware. For us, this is real. These are our homes. These are our farms. This is a place where we live and raise our families. So for us, this is something that's serious. Now, long before I ever moved to Delaware, when I got out of the Navy at the end of the Vietnam War, I served as a naval flight officer in Southeast Asia and other places. Long before I ever did any of that, long before I went to Ohio State, studied economics, long before I grew up in Virginia, I was born in West Virginia. I was born in a coal mining town called Beckley, West Virginia. My dad, coming out of high school, Shady Springs High School in Beaver, West Virginia, was for a short while, a coal miner. When my sister and I, even after we had grown up and left West Virginia, she was, I think, off to be in the third grade, I was going off to be in the second grade. We come back and visit my grandparents, my mom's parents in Beaver, West Virginia, right outside of Beckley. And there was a coal miner who lived next door to my grandparents. And he had a big a field of about a 2 or 3, 4 acre field right next to my grandparents' house. And I remember his name's Mr. Metters. We always call him Mr. Metters. And Mr. Metters would come home from work about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and he'd always have his coal mining clothes on. He was a coal miner, and he mined coal for decades. And he also owned a cow. And in that 3 or 4 acre field, he kept his cow in his shed. And my sister and I, when he'd come home, he'd clean up, and then he would come over and milk his cow. And he would let us milk his cow. Mr. Meadows made, he didn't make his living off the cow, the milk from that cow. He made his living as a coal miner. And he wasn't the only person in West Virginia who made their living mining coal. And there's still a number of people in West Virginia whose income is derived from mining coal. And they're one of the top 5 states in the country in terms of coal production. Among the others are Wyoming, Kentucky, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. So West Virginia is one of the top 5 coal-producing states. And the number of people working in each of those states today, as opposed to when my sister and I were little kids running out with Mr. Meadows to milk his cow, the number of people in the coal mining business employed by coal mining companies is come down a whole lot. But for these people who have these jobs, they're good-paying jobs, and they're life-sustaining jobs for their families. And as we try to figure out how do we reduce the threat to all of us, not just in Delaware, not just in America, but around the world, as we try to figure out how do we reduce the threat to all of us from high levels of carbon in our atmosphere, is there a way to do that? Is there a way to do that that's also respectful of the needs of people in Wyoming and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, Illinois and Kentucky who are trying to make a living? And all they want to do is mine coal. That's what they've done maybe all their lives. They want to be able to continue to do that. Is there a way where, golden rule again, we can somehow adopt a policy or policies that are mindful of their need to be able to sustain and support their own families, and at the same time to make sure in doing that they don't endanger the rest of us? That's the dilemma that we're in. There's sort of we have a moral imperative to look out for them, the coal miners and their families, in those states I've mentioned, and we have a moral imperative to look out for everybody else, including the folks here and up and down the East Coast and the West Coast, others whose lives are going to be changed if we don't do something, continue to make progress. We're making progress, but continue to make progress with respect to reducing the amount of carbon in our air. I think it's possible to actually, I don't think it's necessarily true that there's no way we can try to at least maybe address both moral imperatives. to try to make sure that the folks who for generations have mined coal, they can continue to do that in a way that's not just economically sustainable, but environmentally sustainable. And do so in a way that actually looks out for the legitimate interests of a whole lot of us who come from states where we don't mine coal. One of the biggest sources of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere continues to be coal-fired plants. We generate electricity, and it used to be, I think, about 40% of the electricity generated in the U.S. came from coal-fired plants. Maybe another, 20% or so from nuclear power plants, another 20% or so from natural gas-fired plants, and the rest from hydroelectric and solar, wind, and so forth. And that mix has changed a little bit, as the presiding officer knows, and today coal is down to about 30%. Natural gas, in terms of generating capacity, is up to about 30%. Nuclear is still in there about 20. We're adding a couple of nuclear plants in the next few years, maybe building some modular plants, smaller plants. We are generating ever more electricity from wind, and a bit more from solar, and from geothermal and from hydro. But coal's down from 40 to maybe 30%. And the projection is that maybe by 2030, it'll be down from, say, 30% to maybe as low as 20, 25%. And that's going to create some hardships for the folks in those states, including my native state. Is there some way that we can actually help them while at the same time we're helping ourselves, those of us who aren't from those 5 states? And for as long as I can remember, Mr. President, I've heard people talking about, including from this floor for many years, Robert Byrd, former majority leader, the dean of the Senate, I think maybe the longest serving person in the House and Senate in the history of our country. But he was a big champion of clean coal technology. And we have pursued in this country, Mr. President, since 1997, clean coal carbon capture and sequestration technology since 1997. We have spent, I'm told, about just in this last decade, we spent about $20 billion since 2005, something like that in the last decade. And we've got a success story. We've had a lot of disappointments, but now we have a success story. I just want to share that with our colleagues today. And the success story on U.S. clean coal is a project down in southwest Texas, in Houston, where there's an NRG. NRG is a big utility company. And that project is a clean coal project generating electricity. It's going to come online sometime late next year. There are other projects underway, and we're continuing to invest a lot of money in clean coal technology. We need to continue to do more. Last thing I want to say is this. We face many threats to our nation these days. ISIS is certainly one of those. Other terrorist threats are those. Cybersecurity, those are certainly threats that we face. We have an obligation to our grandchildren and their grandchildren to be able to make sure we address those threats. This is not a battle that the U.S. can win alone on those fronts, nor with respect to our climate change concerns. And it's going to take a coalition of many nations, and we are one of those nations. And as one of the nations that probably puts as much CO2 in the air as anybody else, we have an obligation to try to figure out how to reduce that amount and to reduce the threat. In short, we need to be a leader. We need to be a leader. And not just saying to other nations, you should do this, but also follow our example. And what we're trying to do is to lead by our example. My last words, if I can, we have at our church, Mr. President, you might appreciate this, but our pastor sometimes will say, he'll say, I'm preaching to the choir, but even choirs need to be preached to. The other thing he will say from time to time is, he'll say, I would rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. And for the rest of the world, they don't want to just hear a sermon from us on climate change, they want to see the sermon. And what we're trying to do over the next 15, 20 years is to reduce our CO2 emissions since 2005 by about 30%. Leave it up to the states, not EPA calling the shots, not micromanagement. Leave it up to the states to figure out what works best in their states to help us meet that national target. 30% reduction from 2005 to 2030. That's the deal. That's the goal. My hope is that we'll do our part. We'll provide the leadership that's needed, not by just what we say, but by what we do. And with that, I yield the floor.